So we talked about quite a few different strands of ancient Near Eastern thought that are in biblical theology. You do give us kind of a paradigm on page 176 of the book that is an overall paradigm that you see within the Bible that corresponds to the paradigm you see in the ancient Near Eastern tropes and stories. And so, can you just give us a brief overview of if an ancient Near Eastern person who was familiar with these tropes were reading the biblical story, what are
Yeah.
these main highlights they're going to pick out of the story and understand?
If an ancient Near Eastern person, a pagan, are you saying, reads biblical stuff? I just
Perhaps,
want to be clear. I want to
so
understand the
yeah,
question clearly. So,
yeah. Maybe we can say whether Israelite or not, but they are faithful to Yahweh. They're learning this story, these scriptures, and they are seeing correspondences to the neighboring cultures, maybe their old culture, whatever it may be.
yeah.
Um, it seems like there's the list that you have given of the paradigm. It corresponds closely with, okay, a foreign deity will have these steps in their agenda, and Yahweh, he uses those same steps to communicate to his people.
Yes.
And so, give us a brief overview of what are those steps in the story or in the plan of Yahweh with his people.
Okay. I'll read through the paradigm and illustrate it by the old covenant and by the new. Okay.
Sounds great.
So steps. God works by his spirit through the word of prophet figure. Okay, so the covenant, the prophet figure is Moses. God's working by his spirit through him to war against and defeat his foes, and mainly that's Egypt, because that was warfare against Egypt, and Moses, by the spirit, called the shots. You know, he so and they, incidentally, that's something you never find in the ancient Near East. That
Hmm.
somebody says what a god is going to do, and then he does it. That just doesn't happen. It's not on record as happening. Um, the Hittites was, for instance, one account. The king is going against a rebellious vassal, and there's a rainstorm that makes it that so that the vassal city fortress can't see the approach of his army, and so he gets to have a surprise attack, and he wins easily. Well, he then attributes that rainstorm to the storm god. So he'll take they'll take a natural event
Hmm.
like that and attribute it to the god, but it's never said ahead of time the god's
There's
going to do this and then he does it.
not a prediction of
So
Yahweh's actions.
there's
That's
never a prediction.
interesting.
So anyway, so God works through Moses to do that, and then he establishes a covenant after the warfare against Egypt, and that covenant establishes God's people as God's people. Clearly, they're invited to it and they join. So that's all there. And then he establishes a temple among his people, which he does, the tabernacle. So it's a perfect outline of that paradigm. The new covenant, God works by his spirit through the word, capital W, his son. And clearly that's everything Jesus said and did was spirit, right? He said, John 6:63, the words I speak to you are spirit and they are life. His healings were by the Spirit. His casting out demons was by the Spirit. It was all Holy Spirit. And Jesus waged that warfare. His whole ministry was warfare, in fact, because it was the light invading the darkness, pushing the darkness back. But the result of that was that he established a covenant with his people, right? And the ratification of it, the ratification sacrifice, if you will, was on the cross. Um, and then after that, that establishes the covenant, and he makes a temple among his people. But of course, now the temple is us,
Right.
individually and corporately, the temple of living stones. So these things that appear somewhat more materially in the Old Testament uh, are realized very spiritually in the New, but it's all there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see, I mean, like you just explained, this happens at Sinai and throughout the biblical story. And then you see the overlap of the temple and image idea in the New Testament when the image God dwells through his spirit in the image, and we also become a temple because he's within us. So
Mhm.
um yeah, I think that's really great just to see again, not only just the way that it makes sense of the biblical story, but just seeing God's grace in communicating to them in a way that they understood, taking these, whether first planting and then using, or afterwards using these tropes, but taking something they would understand to help them understand who is God, what is his intention with us, and just to communicate his love and care for
Yeah.
them.
It's true. And as for the temple thing, incidentally, the basic meaning of a temple in the ancient world was a dwelling.
Right.
The Hittite word for it was egal, which means big house, and the Hebrew word is just a loan word from that, heikal, and it
Right.
means, and that's so in Hebrew, a king could have a heikal because he's pretty important. He gets a big house, and God has a heikal. He's, in fact, sometimes his temple is called a house. In 1 Samuel 7, 2 Samuel 7, talking about the temple, David wants to build the temple. The word used throughout is bayit, house. So we are houses, we're dwellings, where God. So that's why a person can be a temple, even though you think of a temple as a building, because it's a
Right.
dwelling. It's where the God dwells.
Absolutely. Well, we've talked about a lot of comparisons to the ancient Near Eastern literature throughout the Bible, and so I wanted to ask one last question because essentially, what we've established is that the Bible is just another ancient Near Eastern story, right? There's nothing significant about it. So help set me straight there. You write on pages 178 and 179, and this is talking about we're asking the question of how is it that David doesn't just understand these things in light of the tropes. He's just going along and interpreting his circumstances in light of the ancient Near Eastern stories. Does he actually hear God, or does he not? You say, but how are we to then understand the similar claims of divine guidance made by, say, Tutmos III compared to David's claims? So you give an excellent answer to this in the book. So please walk us through a bit of this and show us how the Bible is not just another artifact to be relegated to just a good factual thing to learn.
Okay, well, I want to check what I wrote because I want to be sure. Because I would answer it now without reading what I wrote, but I might as well read what I wrote since you're talking about the book. And so, yeah, well, what I say there on 178, um, David either got guidance from God or by the hand of the Lord upon him, which is what he says, or he did not. And so that's kind of it. The hand of the Lord, uh, the Hebrew word hand can also mean power, depending on the context. We read in Joshua, they conquered Israel by the hand of Joshua. Well, it wasn't just his hand, it was his power, his authority. Well, what is power and authority that was on David? The Spirit. The Spirit is the power. And so David is making a very clear a claim that would have been very clear in the ancient or in Israel and should be clear enough today too. If the hand of the Lord is upon you, if you said that about somebody, I think everybody would understand. You mean the Holy Spirit is on that person. That person's anointed to do or teach this or that. And that's what David is claiming. Um, and so that's the whole point. That's the whole answer for a reader of the Bible. You're not going to understand it unless you have the Spirit helping you to understand it, to accept it as different from Hammurabi's receiving the law from Shamash, or the Egyptian god making gods in his image or stuff like that. It's all spiritual revelation, and it's all the Holy Spirit, therefore.
Mhm.
So that, in a nutshell, that's it. And it's to the unspiritual person who will be unspiritual, it's all nonsense. It's completely ridiculous. You see all these parallels, and you think, well, come on, you want me to believe that Israel was special in all this? They were just copycats. Um,
Right.
and
Well, and
yeah,
I like how you mentioned as well that along the lines of the idea that uh, at worst these foreign gods they are the imagination of the kings. At best, they are rebel spirits that are they're created. They're not true most high gods. They're nothing of the like of that, and so they are something that God comes along and when He deems it's time, easily defeats them. There's no special power in their claims, though the tropes are similar. God is the one that has the power to carry through on his promises, and I think shows also an extra step of care and desire for his people, and I think some of these other deities do just from reading the book and seeing how God interacts and covenants and follows through with his people to the end.
Absolutely. And I would actually kind of reverse the way you put that, if I may. I think at best they were just human imagination. At worst,
Well,
they were demonic inspiration, right?
fair, yeah.
Uh, but
It's a good
but
point.
I suspect that I suspect, frankly, that evil spirits are very much involved in it all the time, or most of the time. Because in Deuteronomy 32, before they go over, God gives Moses this prophetic poem, which says, you're going to go over there, you're going to conquer, you're going to get fat and sassy, you're going to forget who all the blessings came from, you're going to offer your sacrifices to demons. And I forget how the NIV translates this, but they don't translate it as demons, and they really should. The word is shedim. It occurs in Babylonian, shedu. It's a spirit, it's a demon. And gods you had not known. And in 1 Corinthians 10:20, Paul makes the same point. Pagans offer their sacrifices to demons. And they're very active. I was in a church once where one of my colleagues, I will not name him, but he's a dear brother, but this was an OP church, and I'm not arguing against the OP church, but he was a guest preacher, and I was there visiting, and he gave this sermon about Mark 1, and he did deal with the exorcism. But then he took the line that B.B. Warfield and folks back at Princeton took 100 years ago, that, well, this happened in Jesus' ministry to show who Jesus was. Well, there was another theology colleague there in the congregation, and after the sermon, I asked him, what do you think of that? He said, well, 5 minutes in a village in India would change his mind about that. Demons are active. And in the third world, there's no question about it. They know it. But in the West, where we beneficiaries of the Enlightenment and we're just plastered over with reason, we don't think much about demons or even angels. But it's
Right.
very real. And so Paul says something in 1 Timothy 4:1 that's relevant for the church today. He warns about the doctrines of demons, false ideas, false theology. They will try to infiltrate the church with that and weaken it. So there's an awful lot involved in all this. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
I'm not going to write a demonology. I'm not crazy about demons, but I'm just saying it is a thing.